Bill, it's great to see you today.
Great to be here.
Bill, you're the author of the Magnitsky Act, as well as coming out with two books that just sold records between the Freezing Order and Red Notice. So you know Putin pretty well and what sort of a threat he poses. When did you realize how dangerous Vladimir Putin really is?
Well, I mean, his level of depravity has increased over time, not because he was, I mean, I think he's always been a sort of psychopathic, depraved individual, but I think that he's also been sort of a little man who lacked confidence. And it's over time that we've started to see his true colors come out. And so there were people who knew about him, in like before he ever even became president. There's books about when he was uh, the head of the St. Petersburg administration and so on, where he was doing all sorts of nasty stuff. But my first encounter with Putin and his criminality was all around the Magnitsky story. I had a lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei discovered a massive Russian government corruption scheme that involved stealing $230 million of taxes that I paid to the Russian government from the Russian government. Sergei and I exposed the fraud. Sergei was in Russia. I was abroad. I was living in London, and then they arrested, tortured, and killed Sergei. And I would have thought once we had exposed this fraud, which was a fraud against his government, that Putin would care. But Putin didn't care about the people who stole the money. I mean, I should say he didn't care about that they stole the money. He cared about Sergei exposing them. And so as Sergei was killed, and then Putin started participating in the cover-up of the murder, and he didn't seem to care about the money that was stolen. He only cared about covering up and protecting the people who stole it and the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. That's when it became obvious to me that Putin was a criminal. And I started going around the world telling everybody Putin is a criminal, Putin is a murderer, Putin was directly involved in a conspiracy to cover up a murder. And no one wanted to hear it. Everyone was making too much money in Russia, and so they just tried to shun me and freeze me out because I was an unprofitable message. And and then as of course he showed his true colors in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And again, nobody wanted to really cut him off, and so they created this stupid narrative, which was that the taking of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine, that wasn't Russia doing it. That was, quote, Russian-backed separatists. And by having the West define it that way, it gave everybody an excuse not to get involved, to say, well, this is a civil war. These are just different people in Ukraine fighting with each other. This is not Putin, and we can carry on doing business with Russia. And the Germans continue to carry on building pipelines, and all sorts of other people were continuing to do business with the oligarchs. And I should say that people even in Ukraine were all sort of looking the other way because there were still people benefiting from Russia. And I remember when Putin was lining up at the border of Ukraine, everybody a lot of people in Ukraine were saying, "Oh, he's not going to do it," and everyone said he's not going to do it, and then he did it. And by the way, we haven't even begun to see the depths of depravity that Putin is ready to go to. He's not done with the nastiness in Ukraine. He's just showing us the first signs.
A lot of people argue, Bill, that Putin's interest is Ukraine and only Ukraine. And once he conquers Ukraine, he'll be pacified and things will stop. Do you agree with that? Do you think Putin would stop at Ukraine, or do his plans go further?
Well, let me explain to your audience why Putin went to Ukraine in the first place, because I think this will explain what happens next. Putin is primarily a financial criminal. That was his main definition for the first 22 years of his presidency. It sounds crazy even saying that, 22 years of his presidency, because what normal country has a 22-year president? It's now 24 years. But his main objective was to steal money, and he stole a lot of money. He and the people around him, like maybe 1,000 people around him, stole $1 trillion from the Russian state. And I don't say that just casually. I say that as somebody who's researched it with great effort over a long period of time. $1 trillion has been stolen by Putin and the people around him from the Russian state. That money should have been spent on hospitals, schools, roads, and other public services. Instead, it was spent on yachts, private jets, villas, and all sorts of stuff like that. And it's one thing to steal 10 billion, maybe even 50 billion, or even 100 billion, but to steal $1 trillion from a large country like Russia, where everybody else is living in abject poverty. I was like spreading gasoline all over the floor of Russia. And it's just waiting for a match to ignite. And Putin understood that. And he particularly understood that sort of coming out of COVID, where everyone was particularly raw and exposed and feeling bad. And he understood that that match could have been lit by anybody in any situation, and people would have directed their anger towards him. And so if you're a little man like Putin, who's terrified of losing power, and by the way, if he loses power, he ends up going to jail, losing his money, and dying. So you've got this little man, stolen too much money, desperately afraid for his life of losing power. What do? You create a foreign enemy and you start a war. That's what the Ukraine invasion is all about. It's not about NATO enlargement. It's not about any kind of Russian imperialism. This is purely about a guy who's desperate to survive and is ready to sacrifice anybody and everything to survive. And that's what this invasion is all about. Now, and therefore, there's no reverse gear here. The whole point is to be at war. It's not like he has any specific territorial objectives. It's to be at war. It's to show the Russian people that there's an enemy that he's defeating, and he's the leader, and you shouldn't be mad at him. You should be mad at them. And he's never in all the time that I've known how he operates, he has never negotiated. He's never compromised. He's never backed down, ever. And he's not going to do it with Ukraine. There's no peace deal to be done. There's no compromise to be reached. And if the West abandons Ukraine and Ukraine doesn't have the resources to fend him off, it doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. It's not the end of the story. He's got to keep on going. He's got to keep on showing the Russian people that he's the strong man in charge. He's the war president. And what does he do next? He goes to Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, all countries that he doesn't think should exist independently. Those countries are members of NATO. So he lines up on the border of those countries after having taken Ukraine. And then he then waits and watches while we all have a total moment of self-doubt, where all sorts of pundits go onto CNN and Fox News and say, well, wait a second, are we going to go to war with Russia over a country that 99% of Americans couldn't find on a map? And he's hoping that America will just abandon NATO the way that America effectively abandoned Ukraine. That's what he would hope for. And one of two things happens then. Either America honors its NATO obligations and then goes to war with Russia, which will be 100 times more expensive in terms of money, and infinitely more expensive in terms of the loss of American lives if that happens, which would be a catastrophe. Or the other catastrophe is that America doesn't honor its NATO obligations. Instead, lets it go. Putin takes over the Baltics and then moves on Poland. And eventually America's got to get involved in any case. At what point do we allow him to take Germany as well? And so the idea that he's going to stop at Ukraine, if he were to succeed in that, is just a complete naive fantasy.
So let's look at the other side of this. How about if the West does give Ukraine the support it needs, it does give it the aid it needs, and Ukraine, though outnumbered, is able to outgun Russia with advanced technologies and to continue keeping the Russians at bay? Do you think that Putin has the ability, either financially, militarily, or politically, domestically within his own country, to continue waging war against Ukraine perpetually? Or do you think that he might reach a point where it becomes his regime's too brittle that it might just break?
Well, I think that he has unlimited capacity for pain, since he doesn't feel it himself. He just has no sense of empathy whatsoever. So he doesn't, look at the Second World War. Like, the Russia lost, or the Soviet Union lost, like, 25 million people. So far he's only down 400,000. He'd be glad to throw another 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, whatever into the mix, because it doesn't matter to him. He doesn't care. He truly, he doesn't lose a wink of sleep at night over it. However, if we gave the Ukrainians the tools that they need, then one thing could happen. That my prediction is that if Ukraine were to succeed in either expelling Russia completely or humiliating Russia in such an obvious way that it's obvious to the people of Russia, then they're going to question this military mistake that led to the loss of 500,000 soldiers, or maybe more at that time, whatever the number is, that led to the loss of $500 billion or $1 trillion, whatever the economic damage is to Russia. And they're going to say, well, wait a second, why do we have this person who's created all these losses for us? And then there's the possibility of a public uprising in Russia. And so to the extent that people don't like Putin, the best way to express that feeling is to help Ukrainians humiliate him.
So going forward, let's imagine the post-Putin world. Do you think that Russia can be ever reintegrated? And what do you think the future of Ukraine looks like after the war?
Well, the future of Ukraine is very much dependent on the outcome of the war. There's, for example, a lot of people that when we're talking about the $300 billion of central bank reserves that are frozen, there was the original argument that should be used for the reconstruction. And I've always said to anybody who says that should be used for the reconstruction, well, there's not going to be a country to reconstruct if Ukraine loses the war. And so that money should be used for the defense of Ukraine. We can worry about reconstruction later. That's a high-class problem. Now, the future of Ukraine is totally dependent on how this thing ends up resolving itself. If Ukraine successfully fights off Russia and defeats Russia, first of all, Russia will probably be a different country, and Ukraine will be a much more safe country. The more likely scenario is that Russia continues fighting, Ukraine continues fighting. Neither side has a decisive military advantage, and you end up with this frozen conflict situation. I imagine at some point Ukraine joins NATO, and at some point, hopefully that membership leads to Ukraine living in some kind of safety and decency. But we're nowhere near that right now. We're in a full-scale war in which Ukraine could potentially lose if it doesn't get more military resources.
Bill, let me ask you one last question. As you know, some policymakers in the United States say that Ukraine should not attack Russian oil fields or the refineries because this could increase the cost of oil. But you know Russia really well, and you know how economics in Russia work. Do you think it's effective to be attacking Russian, let's say, ports from where they export the oil or the oil refineries? What do you think? Is it a good strategy or not? And how significant is it to Russia?
Well, I think Ukraine is at a significant resource disadvantage to Russia in terms of the war. Russia has much more military resources, much more money. And so Ukraine has to be clever. This is a David versus Goliath fight. And I think it's extremely clever to be looking at the leverage points, the nodes at which Russia depends. And that their oil refineries are sitting ducks. The Black Sea Fleet is a sitting duck. And a lot of the military infrastructure is sitting duck, and Ukraine is now developing the drone resources to attack these places, and hopefully can even use some of these long-range missiles to attack these targets. And I think that whoever is making these statements in America, if America was being attacked, America would be fighting back with everything they've got. I don't think that it's right, moral or logical to be telling Ukraine to restrain themselves. Sure, there's oil prices are high, but that's a pretty small problem compared to the bigger problems if Ukraine loses this war.
Bill, I totally agree. And I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Good, thank you.